The words hit like a slap, sharp, arrogant, and delivered with the smirk of a man who thought the room already belonged to him. A hush rippled across the chamber. Staffers froze. Cameras zoomed in. Even the air seemed to pause, as if refusing to move until anyone broke the spell. Mike Johnson leaned back in his chair, satisfied, the smug curve of his grin announcing that he believed he'd landed the final blow. He had thrown his insult like a stone, certain it would shatter the woman across from him. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She blinked once, steady and unbroken. Her eyes locked forward like a soldier who had marched through storms far worse than the thunder erupting here. A few gasps slipped from those seated behind her, as though they were bracing for impact. Johnson expected outrage. He expected stammering. He expected humiliation to settle over her the way it had settled over so many before her. He didn't understand who he was dealing with. In that split second of stillness, their contrast became unmistakable. Johnson, chest-puffed, radiated entitlement, basking in what he believed was dominance. Jasmine, and focused, embodied a quieter kind of strength, one rooted in a lifetime of fighting to be heard, to be seen, and to be respected in rooms just like this. Social feeds would later replay the moment frame by frame. Commentators would analyze it, comedians would parody it, and TikTok editors would layer dramatic music beneath it. But in real time, that hearing room was utterly silent. No shuffle of paper, no whisper, no movement, just tension so thick it pressed against every ribcage and dared the world to exhale. Johnson's gaze flicked around the room, searching for approving nods, hungry for validation. Jasmine didn't grant him even a glance. She didn't bow, didn't break, didn't shrink. Instead, she lifted her chin, letting the weight of the insult hang in the air long enough for everyone to recognize it for what it was, not strength, but insecurity, masquerading as authority. Then when she finally parted her lips to speak, there was no tremor, only purpose. Those watching leaned forward, sensing a shift they couldn't yet name. A storm was gathering behind her eyes, and the man who mocked her was about to discover what happens when dignity refuses to bow to cruelty. No one in America expected what she would say next. This was never just a routine committee hearing. It wasn't one of those sleepy sessions where half the room scrolled their phones and the public tuned out before the opening statement. From the moment the gavel struck, the atmosphere carried a pulse, electric, uneasy, and heavy with political consequence. Everyone present understood that the topic on the table had cracked open a raw national nerve. Funding fights, constitutional questions, and accusations of bias had collided, creating the kind of pressure cooker moment that turns hearings into history. The country was watching, and every word would echo far beyond those wood-paneled walls. The networks sensed it. Producers cleared airspace. Commentators sharpened their lines. Clips from the morning session were already circulating online, each one fanning partisan flames. By the time Jasmine Crockett leaned into her microphone, millions were either glued to live coverage or waiting for the next viral angle to drop into their feeds. In an era when politics had merged with performance, hearings weren't just oversight, they were battlegrounds, where careers were cemented or shattered in a single sentence. Tensions were rising long before the insult landed. Members snapped at one another over procedure. Snide asides cut through scripted talking points. The chairman's patience thinned by the minute. What should have been a sober discussion about policy had morphed into a stage 4 ideological combat: order versus justice, tradition versus inclusion, power versus accountability. Mike Johnson positioned himself as the enforcer, determined to dominate the narrative. Jasmine knew the stakes were larger: representation, truth, and the right to speak without being steamrolled by arrogance. She had walked into that room carrying more than policy notes. She carried the weight of constituents who were tired of being diminished. She represented Americans who knew what it felt like to have their intelligence questioned, their accents mocked, or their patriotism dismissed. She entered the hearing prepared, composed, and armed with facts, but also fueled by something deeper. To her, this debate wasn't theoretical. It was personal. And for Johnson, the moment offered something he craved. He saw the hearing as a chance to score a win on national television, to play the strong-handed inquisitor, to embarrass a rising voice before she became harder to silence. The imbalance of power seemed obvious. A senior figure with institutional backing versus a newer, outspoken member still carving her lane. He believed the optics favored him. What he didn't see was the shift happening outside that chamber. Audiences were no longer passive. They didn't just consume, they reacted, amplified, and judged in real time. A single disrespectful exchange could ignite hashtags by nightfall and rewrite reputations by morning. The internet had no patience for bullies, and no tolerance for polished cruelty masquerading as procedure. As the questioning intensified, staffers exchanged wary glances. Something was about to break. Jasmine could feel it: the condescension sharpening, the interruptions stacking, the provocation escalating by design. Johnson wasn't searching for truth. He was laying a trap, but he underestimated the woman seated across from him and misread the public mood entirely. Careers can pivot on a single hearing. Movements can spark from a single voice refusing to bend. And in that pressurized chamber, the air tightened to a breaking point. And that's when Mike made his first mistake. Mike Johnson had perfected the art of performance politics. To his supporters, he styled himself as a guardian of order, stern and unafraid to put people in their place. But inside that hearing room, the mask slipped just enough for everyone to witness the other side: the ego, the impatience, and the hunger to dominate rather than deliberate. He didn't enter the chamber searching for clarity. He came in hunting for a spectacle, one where he could frame himself as the righteous enforcer and cast his opponents as reckless, emotional, or unfit for the stage he believed he owned. From the first hour of testimony, his pattern was unmistakable. He cut off questions before they were finished. He lectured witnesses instead of listening to answers. He pounced on phrasing, tone, and trivialities, twisting them into grand accusations. Each interruption carried the same subtext: "How dare you challenge me?" His voice boomed not for substance, but for effect. It wasn't enough for him to be heard, he needed others to feel small. To those who have watched him over the years, the contradiction has always been striking. He speaks often about respect, faith, decorum, and civility. Yet when confronted with a voice he cannot control, his restraint evaporates. The moment a woman, especially a woman of color, stands her ground, a switch flips, the measured cadence gives way to agitation. The calm posture turns rigid. His words sharpen, dripping with condescension that he disguises as procedure. It's all there, just beneath the polished soundbites, the belief that authority belongs to him by default. This hearing put that contradiction on full display. Johnson wasn't simply disagreeing, he was performing dominance. Every question was a trap, structured to corner, belittle, or When Jasmine cited facts, he changed the subject. When she stayed composed, he raised his voice. When she followed rules, he rewrote them on the spot. He needed her rattled, because a calm and confident opponent exposed his greatest weakness: the fragility behind the swagger. He paced his words like a prosecutor delivering closing arguments to an imaginary jury, one made up of donors, pundits, and partisan cheerleaders waiting for a clip they could blast across social media. And that was the game. This wasn't governance, it was theater. He wanted the viral moment, the triumphant might, the screenshots spreading through inboxes and group chats with captions like "Watch Johnson destroy Crockett." He wasn't focused on the policy at hand. He was focused on the camera lens and the political scoreboard in his head. But something unexpected was happening. The more aggressively he pressed, the more the audience watching at home began to shift in their seats. His tone read less like strength and more like insecurity, a man rattled by a challenger who refused to shrink. The performance started to backfire. Instead of elevating him, it exposed him. Still, Johnson pushed harder, convinced he could force submission if he simply kept swinging. He leaned over the microphone, voice dripping with insinuation, framing his words as if Jasmine were uninformed, emotional, or out of line for daring to challenge him. He tried to lecture her on procedures she knew as well as he did. He tried to frame her measured questions as outbursts. He tried to claim control, not through reason, but through volume. It was the same familiar strategy bullies deploy in boardrooms, classrooms, and family tables across America: interrupt, belittle, escalate, repeat. His allies sat back, silent, perhaps content to let him carry the fight. After all, he looked confident. He sounded forceful. He commanded attention. But beneath the bravado was something that his political instincts failed to detect. The audience was no longer impressed. Viewers didn't hear strength. They heard contempt. They didn't see leadership. They saw performance. And most importantly, they didn't see Jasmine losing ground. They saw her holding it. That was the flaw in Johnson's crusade. He believed the era of one-sided takedowns still existed. He failed to grasp that this time, the person he was trying to steamroll wasn't intimidated, wasn't shaken, and wasn't alone. She had millions watching who knew exactly what it felt like to sit across from a man who thought power gave him the right to diminish others. Johnson wanted a moment that would burnish his authority. Instead, he was building the stage for his own unraveling. The camera he relied on so confidently would soon broadcast a very different story, and the internet would make sure it spread far beyond that room. He just didn't know it yet. Long before the hearing, lights blazed across her face. Before millions watched her poised beneath the weight of hostility, Jasmine Crockett had lived a story that made composure her second language. Her journey didn't begin in marble halls or political circles. It began in the corners of communities too often forgotten, places where ambition was a whisper and justice felt like a distant rumor. She grew up surrounded by people who worked twice as hard for half as much. Teachers who stretched paychecks to buy classroom supplies, families juggling multiple jobs just to stay afloat. From an early age, Jasmine understood that fairness wasn't automatic. It was something you had to fight for. When others dreamed of comfort, she dreamed of impact. She learned to listen before speaking, to prepare before entering any room, and to stand tall even when others spoke over her. By the time she entered law school, she was already used to being underestimated. Professors mistook quiet confidence for uncertainty. Classmates assumed her calm meant she was easy to outshine. They learned quickly. Her intelligence wasn't performative. It was surgical. She dissected arguments, challenged assumptions, and made even the most seasoned voices pause before interrupting her again. Her professors began to say it in hallways and faculty lounges. She's not just talented, she's relentless. After graduation, Jasmine didn't chase corporate prestige. She went home. She opened her practice to those who couldn't afford one. She sat across from single mothers, wrongfully accused teenagers, veterans drowning in paperwork. Her office lights burned late into the night because justice, she believed, shouldn't clock out at 5 p.m. That grit, the quiet, but couldn't the wall, kind, became her foundation. In the courtroom, she earned a reputation for grace under pressure. Prosecutors who tried to rattle her learned it was impossible. She could absorb aggression and return precision. Every win wasn't just a victory for her clients, it was proof that patience and intellect could outlast arrogance and power. Those who watched her work saw the same calm resolve that would later define her on the national stage. Politics, for Jasmine, wasn't a career move. It was an extension of duty. When she stepped into public service, she carried the same instincts that guided her as a lawyer: defend the voiceless, expose the lies, and never confuse volume with truth. She entered Congress not to belong, but to represent. And that made her dangerous to the establishment that preferred silence over strength. By the time she faced Mike Johnson, she had already endured storms that would have crushed others. She had faced online smear campaigns that tried to twist her passion into aggression, pundits who reduced her intellect to soundbites, and colleagues who mistook her calm for submission. Each encounter had forged another layer of composure. She had become fluent in restraint, practiced in grace, and trained in the art of letting arrogance destroy itself. What made Jasmine's presence magnetic wasn't only her intelligence, it was the moral gravity behind it. She carried herself like someone who understood that every microphone could become a mirror for a generation watching. To her supporters, she symbolized proof that dignity could survive the noise. To her critics, she was a reminder that eloquence and empathy were more threatening than outrage. Her staff often said she prepared for hearings like a prizefighter before a title match. Every document, every footnote, every procedural rule memorized. But unlike those who performed for the camera, Jasmine prepared for the people. "If I'm not fighting for them," she once said, "then I don't belong here." That mindset meant that every jab she endured on Capitol Hill wasn't just political theater, it was personal resistance. Outside the chamber, the country had already started to notice her. Clips of her speeches circulated on social media. Young women saved her lines as affirmations. Immigrant families replayed her words at dinner tables, telling their daughters, "Watch her, that's how you answer without losing yourself." Her following grew not because she shouted the loudest, but because she stood the firmest. In Washington, respect often came dressed in privilege. Jasmine earned hers through persistence. She didn't climb, she carved her way upward. Every insult hurled her way became a lesson in focus. Every attempt to sideline her only widened her reach. And when the cameras turned toward her that day, she wasn't chasing validation. She was doing what she had always done, holding her ground. That's why the moment Mike Johnson launched his attack, she didn't blink. She had seen that expression before, in judges who doubted her credentials, in opponents who mocked her tone, in commentators who tried to frame her intelligence as defiance. Each time, she had chosen the same response: steady, calm, precise truth, and the quiet power of refusing to be moved. In a room filled with microphones and egos, she carried something rarer: authenticity. It radiated in her posture, in her pauses, in the way she met hostility not with fire, but with reason sharpened to a blade. Viewers could feel it even through their screens. This wasn't a politician surviving an attack. This was a woman who had fought her whole life for the right to stand in that room, and she wasn't going anywhere. As Johnson's tone grew louder, Jasmine's silence grew heavier, commanding the space until every sound bent around her focus. She wasn't defending herself. She was reminding the room who she was, and why she was there. She had faced worse before, and she would not break here. The rhythm of the hearing began to warp. What had started as controlled debate now pulsed with rising hostility. Each exchange grew sharper, shorter, louder. Mike Johnson leaned forward, his voice cutting through the chamber like a blade, every syllable sharpened for impact. He wasn't asking questions anymore, he was issuing commands. "Let me finish," Jasmine began, her tone calm, deliberate. He pounced. "No, you'll listen." The words snapped through the air, his interruption echoing louder than any policy point he'd made all morning. The tension in the room thickened. Cameras caught the tightening of her jaw, the brief inhale she took before steadying herself again. He mistook that breath for retreat. It wasn't. Johnson's voice rose another octave, his gestures larger, his sentences faster. Theatrics disguised as authority. He framed her composure as defiance, her patience as weakness, her silence as surrender. Every time she tried to respond, he talked over her, desperate to reclaim the floor. Each interruption chipped at decorum, revealing the raw insecurity hiding beneath his confidence. Members shifted in their seats. Some watched with discomfort, others with fascination. Staffers exchanged wary glances. This was no longer about the issue at hand. It was personal now. The air vibrated with unease, the kind that fills a room right before something historic happens. Still, Jasmine didn't bite. She waited for each interruption to exhaust itself, then spoke with the same measured precision that had carried her through law school, through courtrooms, through every moment she'd been told she didn't belong. Her calm began to feel like defiance itself. The more he raised his voice, the quieter she became, and the quieter she became, the more powerful her words landed. Johnson noticed. His face flushed. The steady rhythm of her replies began to unnerve him. He slammed his palm on the desk to reclaim dominance, the sound cracking through the silence. "You're out of line," he barked. She looked at him, unblinking, unimpressed, and said softly, "I'm exactly where I belong." The sentence wasn't shouted, but it rippled through the room with the weight of thunder. Gasps from the back rose, phones lifted. A reporter whispered, "That one's going viral." Johnson's composure frayed, his rebuttals grew sloppy, his sentences tangled. The more he tried to assert control, the less he had. The imbalance of power began to invert, not through volume, but through grace. She refused to match his tone. She exposed it. At one point, he tried to cut her off mid-sentence again, but this time the chair intervened. "The gentlewoman has the floor," the voice declared. Applause erupted from a few corners, quickly hushed, but undeniably there. Even those who had come into the hearing indifferent could feel it. Something had shifted. Viewers across the country leaned closer to their screens. They had seen this dynamic before, the man with the gavel, the woman he tried to silence. But this one felt different. This time, the outcome wasn't inevitable. This time, she was holding her ground, and the bully was losing his balance. Johnson shuffled his notes, fumbling for a line that could reset the hierarchy he'd built on intimidation. But every attempt only revealed more desperation. His tone veered from patronizing to pleading to angry. He had entered the hearing to assert superiority. Now he was fighting for control of his own image. Jasmine, meanwhile, remained the eye of the storm. Every calm response landed like a mirror, reflecting his aggression back at him. "You can raise your voice," she said at one point, "but it won't raise your argument." The chamber went still. For the first time, Johnson didn't have a comeback. His lips pressed together, his gaze flicked toward the cameras, suddenly aware that millions were witnessing not power, but panic. Tension hummed like a live wire. The confrontation wasn't over. It was only cresting. The audience, both inside and online, could feel the build-up to something seismic. Jasmine's patience wasn't passivity anymore. It was strategy. Every insult he hurled only dug his own rhetorical grave. He leaned back, forced a laugh that didn't land, and muttered, "You're emotional, Congresswoman." That was the spark. The insult that crossed from policy into prejudice, the one that would echo across the internet within hours. Jasmine didn't move, didn't blink, didn't let the comment pass either. She drew in a single, quiet breath. He thought she would fold. He was wrong. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. The insult, small, sharp, and meant to wound, still hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Jasmine didn't move. The camera zoomed in, capturing the faintest flicker in her expression. Not anger, not surprise, but something quieter, steadier. Resolve. Emotional, he had called her. It wasn't new. It was the word used to dismiss every woman who dared to sound sure of herself. Every black woman who spoke with fire and intellect in the same breath. But she had learned long ago that emotion and truth weren't enemies, they were allies. And now, in front of the world, she would show exactly what that meant. She leaned forward, fingers interlaced on the table, and began to speak slowly, evenly, every word deliberate. "You know, Congressman," she said, voice measured like a metronome. "It's always interesting when people confuse passion for hysteria, especially when that confusion only seems to happen to certain people in this room." A murmur rippled across the chamber. Johnson shifted, suddenly aware that the dynamic had flipped. She wasn't reacting, she was composing. Each syllable landed like a stone in water, spreading concentric circles of quiet power. She continued, "I've spent my entire career listening to men raise their voices, interrupt, and belittle, all while calling it leadership. And yet, when a woman speaks firmly, it's emotion. When a woman demands respect, it's attitude. When a woman refuses to shrink, it's aggression." No one moved. Her voice had become the only sound that mattered. "Maybe," she added, "what you call emotion is really conviction. Maybe what you're seeing is a reflection of every person who's ever been told to lower their tone just so someone else can feel taller." A low rolled from the audience seats, faint but undeniable. Even through the sterile formality of the chamber, something alive had entered the space. Johnson forced a smirk. "Are you done, Congresswoman?" he asked, his voice brittle. She didn't flinch. "Not yet." Her gaze locked onto his. "You came here today thinking you could provoke me. You thought you could twist this hearing into a spectacle. You thought if you talked over me long enough, I'd lose control, and you'd win the clip you wanted. But here's what you don't seem to understand." She paused, the silence stretching long enough for everyone to lean forward. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. "I'm not here for you." Her tone was almost gentle, but it carried steel beneath the softness. "I'm here for the people watching who don't get to sit in these seats. The ones who are told to calm down when they're right, who are told they're overreacting when they're simply standing up for themselves. I'm here for the women who've been silenced mid-sentence, For the workers who've been dismissed mid-idea. For the students who've been talked over mid. You don't get to decide how we express truth anymore. The room shifted. Staffers who had spent the morning scribbling notes now froze mid. A few members on the panel stared straight ahead, unwilling to meet her eyes. The energy had turned, the aggressor shrinking, while the accused grew larger than the moment itself. Johnson tried to interrupt again, but this time his words stumbled over her cadence. Congresswoman, that's, she raised a single hand, not in defiance, but with the calm authority of someone reclaiming what was always hers. You've had your turn. The room exhaled a low, collective murmur of disbelief and awe. For the first time all day, Mike Johnson didn't know where to look. Jasmine leaned back slightly, letting the quiet linger. The tension wasn't hers anymore, it belonged to him. You call me emotional, she said softly, because it's easier than calling me effective. A sharp intake of breath swept across the room. Cameras caught it all. His stiffened shoulders, the narrowing of his eyes, the faint tremor at the corner of his mouth. He had gone from redditor to spectacle in a matter of seconds. Still, she wasn't finished. When you raise your voice to silence mine, you don't prove strength. You prove fear. You prove that what you can't control, you try to humiliate. But I learned a long time ago when someone tries to make you small, the smartest thing you can do is stand taller. The line landed like a gavel. The chair said nothing. The other members didn't breathe. Johnson's smirk dissolved completely. She went on, every word deliberate. Her rhythm now unmistakably that of a closing argument. You say I'm emotional. I say I'm human. I care about the people who sent me here. And that means I care deeply. And if caring deeply makes me emotional, then this chamber could use a lot more emotion. Applause started at the back, hesitant, breaking through the rules of decorum. Then another clap, then another. Within seconds, it was unstoppable. Even those who had stayed neutral could feel the shift. The rare moment when truth burned brighter than politics. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't smile. She waited until the room quieted, then looked straight into the camera lens, knowing exactly where the clip would travel. You don't get to define dignity, she said. You can try to shout it down, but it doesn't break. Not today. Not ever. That was the line. The moment, the one that would loop endlessly across social media with captions like the day Mike Johnson got schooled and how to handle a bully. Lesson 1. But in that instant, it wasn't about it was about silence. Thick, reverent silence that followed her words. Johnson sat motionless, hands clasped tightly before him, the faint redness of frustration crawling up his neck. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. Nothing came out. The performance was over. The room had moved on without him. Jasmine gathered her notes, methodical and unhurried, the embodiment of composure. When she finally rose from her seat, she didn't look triumphant. She looked centered, like someone who had simply told the truth and let it stand on its own. Reporters in the hallway later said, it felt like watching gravity shift. The bully had been dismantled not by shouting, but by restraint, not by force, but by clarity. As she stepped out of the chamber, flashes erupted, questions flew, and the clip was already uploading to countless feeds. The caption would write itself. Inside, Johnson sat still, staring at the spot where she'd been moments ago, realizing the sound he had always relied on, his voice, had been replaced by something louder, her silence. And for the first time that day, he understood he'd been outmatched before the first word left his mouth. That night, America didn't just watch the clip, it felt it. The hearing had ended hours ago, but the moment was only beginning to live its real life. Across the country, screens lit up one by one, replaying the same 10 seconds that no one could stop talking about. Jasmine's calm stare, the pause, the words that silenced a man who never stopped talking. And in that silence, something shifted. People who'd never cared for politics found themselves frozen in place, whispering, wait, who is she? News anchors cut into scheduled programming, panelists stumbling to explain how a single line could travel faster than any press release. It wasn't outrage fueling the momentum this time. It was relief. Someone had finally said what so many had been waiting to hear, with grace instead of venom, with dignity instead of noise. By midnight, the video was everywhere. Every feed, every show, every timeline. Commentators analyzed her composure like it was a piece of art. They slowed it down frame by frame, the moment she leaned in, the breath before she spoke, the calm power in her eyes. That, one host said, is what leadership used to look like. The next morning, the story was no longer about a hearing. It was about her. Viewers described the feeling of watching the moment as if a weight had lifted, like witnessing justice. Not in policy, but in posture. Offices buzzed. Coffee shops echoed with replayed lines. Parents showed their daughters and said, that's how you stand your ground. Teachers played it in classrooms to show how restraint can roar louder than rage. Commentators from every corner tried to claim the meaning of it. Some called it composure under fire. Others called it courage. But the truth was simpler. It was dignity, unshaken and undeniable. Winning in real time. On living rooms, people saw more than a politician. They saw a reflection of themselves, of every time they'd been interrupted, dismissed, told to lower their voice, to stay in their lane, to smile while swallowing disrespect. Jasmine hadn't just answered Mike Johnson. She had answered all of it, and the country reacted with something rare in modern politics, emotion that felt pure. Not anger, pride, not division, resonance. For days, her words echoed. On morning shows, on late-night comedy, in quiet conversations between coworkers who'd stayed up too late watching replays. Analysts tried to dissect it, but what happened couldn't be measured in seconds. It wasn't about who won the argument, it was about who owned the moment. In just a few minutes, Jasmine Crockett had redefined what power looked like. She proved that strength doesn't always shout, and that silence, when used with precision, can shake a nation. Meanwhile, Mike Johnson's team scrambled to regain control. His aides drafted statements, carefully worded apologies disguised as clarifications, but nothing stuck. Every interview he gave seemed smaller than the one that had undone him. His voice, once so loud, now sounded defensive, even to those who had cheered him on. Jasmine, on the other hand, didn't gloat. She didn't post or boast. She went about her work as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But the country knew better. They'd witnessed something rare, a reminder that integrity still had a pulse, that calm could still conquer chaos. In cities across America, murals began to appear. Artists painted her at that desk, head high, expression still, composure unbroken. Students quoted her in graduation speeches. Editorials titled, "Her Moment, a Masterclass in Moral Clarity." Even those who disagreed with her politics couldn't deny what they'd seen. The respect was reluctant, but it was real. That week, her team's inbox flooded with messages, letters from women in courtrooms, from young men in classrooms, from immigrants who said they'd never felt seen in those marble halls until now. Each note carried the same sentiment in different words. You didn't just speak for yourself, you spoke for us. And so, the ripple grew. What began as an insult inside a committee room had transformed into something larger than politics. It had become a lesson in presence, a reminder that the most devastating blow isn't always the loudest, and that sometimes the most powerful response is the one that refuses to descend to someone else's level. In every retelling, one detail remained constant, the silence that followed her final line. That silence wasn't empty. It was full of reckoning, of respect, of realization. The kind of silence that can't be interrupted because it means something. By the time the weekend arrived, the storm she created wasn't chaos, it was clarity. She had shown the world that composure could be revolutionary, that truth could still find its way through the noise, and that sometimes, the most unshakable force in politics is the one that doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. And somewhere, in living rooms and hearts across the country, people replayed that moment one last time, not for entertainment, but for affirmation. She had faced arrogance with poise. She had met noise with stillness, and in doing so, she hadn't just won the moment. She had changed the tone of the nation. By the time the dust settled, the moment had become more than a headline, it had become a parable. In a political era fueled by spectacle and division, Jasmine Crockett reminded America of something it had almost forgotten, that leadership isn't measured by how loudly you speak, but by how deeply your words resonate. When the noise fades, the image of her sitting calm and unshaken beneath the glare of confrontation lingered in the nation's mind. It wasn't just that she had responded to arrogance, it was how she had done it, without venom, without theatrics, without lowering herself to the level of the insult. That posture, steady, composed, grounded, became the embodiment of a moral lesson America still needed to hear, that dignity is not weakness, it's endurance. For decades, the public stage has rewarded those who shout the longest and mock the hardest. But on that day, Jasmine quietly redefined the currency of influence. She proved that decency still has an audience, that composure can still captivate, and that there's nothing more disarming to a bully than a person who simply refuses to play their game. Commentators called it a victory for restraint, but for many watching, it felt more like vindication. In workplaces, classrooms, homes, everywhere people had ever been interrupted or belittled, they saw in Jasmine a reflection of their own battles. She didn't just speak truth to power. She showed that power means nothing when truth stands unbent. And in a broader sense, her moment became a mirror for the country itself. America has always wrestled with its identity between arrogance and humility, noise and reason, fear and courage. In that hearing room, those contrasts came alive through two people, two energies, two visions of leadership. One tried to dominate through force. The other prevailed through principle. And for once, the outcome wasn't decided by volume. It was decided by values. That's what struck the deepest chord. People didn't just cheer because Jasmine had won. They cheered because she had reminded them of what winning should look like. Not conquest, but character. Not humiliation, but humanity. She hadn't destroyed her opponent. She had dismantled the idea that cruelty is strength. Somewhere, in that balance of patience and power, people recognized something distinctly American, the belief that no title, no privilege, no history can silence someone grounded in truth. Our founding stories, at their core, are built on that same defiance. The farmer who stood up to the empire, the protester who stood up to injustice, the mother who stood up for her child. Jasmine stood in that lineage. not as a symbol of division, but as a reminder that courage can still wear grace, and that grace, that unshakable poise, outlasts everything. Long after the trending clips fade, long after the pundits move on, what remains is the example, the demonstration that strength can be quiet, that the sharpest weapon in politics or life is integrity. History doesn't always remember the loudest voices. It remembers the ones who spoke with purpose, who turned moments of hostility into moments of clarity. That's what Jasmine did. She turned a confrontation into a lesson, an insult into illumination, for a nation weary of shouting matches and cynicism that mattered. Because in that hearing room, amid all the tension and ego, something rare happened. Truth didn't just survive, it prevailed. And so the story closed not with applause, not with outrage, but with realization that dignity will always outlast bullying. That truth, when spoken calmly and confidently, has the power to silence even the most determined noise. As the cameras dimmed and the chatter moved elsewhere, one truth remained steady, the kind that outlives the moment and becomes part of the country's rhythm. When arrogance rises, dignity waits. When cruelty shouts, truth whispers and is still heard. That day, Jasmine Crockett didn't just win an argument, she reminded a divided nation what leadership could look like again. And so, that's how it happened. The moment that began, as a congressional clash, became something far greater. Mike Johnson attacks Jasmine Crockett. Her final line destroys him on live TV wasn't just a headline anymore. It became a symbol of how truth can cut through arrogance, how calm can defeat chaos, and how dignity can stand tall even when surrounded by noise. Jasmine Crockett didn't just speak for herself that day. She spoke for every person who has ever been interrupted, dismissed, or underestimated and chose composure over fury. Her words carried a message that reached far beyond those marble walls. You don't have to match the energy of hate to overpower it. Sometimes, silence and self-respect speak louder than any microphone ever could. But here's the truth. This movement, this awakening of grace in the face of aggression, doesn't end with her. It begins with us, with everyone watching who knows what it feels like to be talked over and still keep their voice steady. With every person who refuses to shrink when challenged. With anyone who still believes that justice and empathy can share the same sentence. Because every time, we choose dignity over disrespect, we write another line in this story, one that doesn't need shouting to be remembered. Though if you believe that calm can be powerful, that truth can still triumph over ego, and that respect will always outlast rage, then you are part of this moment too. Share this story, stand tall in your own. And remember, arrogance fades fast, but dignity echoes. This isn't just her victory, it's ours, and it's only the beginning.